All right, so this is going to be lecture 3. So we're going to talk about sort of the growth of England's empire. There we go. And the growth of other empires as well, and how that kind of will lead toward the Revolutionary Era, which we'll get to in the next lecture. We ended the last one talking about just so many crises, right? Like religious wars and conflicts, again, between European empires, and conflicts between settlers and native people, and between different groups of settlers, and all of England's problems spilling over into the colonies. That's basically the 1600s. Now, as the next century dawns, stability starts to return, and English North America begins to experience remarkable growth. Between 1700 and 1770, settlements that used to be like crude little backwaters became nice, bustling cities. The rates of disease among the settlers declined, settlement pushed westward, and hundreds of thousands of newcomers arrived from Europe. Now, thanks to the high birth rate and to continuing immigration, the population of English North America grew from about 265-ish thousand at the end of the 1600s to more than 2.3 million by 1770. Now, we ought to note, though, that because of the decline in the native population, the overall population of North America was actually smaller in 1770 than it had been in 1492. And probably the most striking characteristic of colonial America over the course of the 1700s, as this new century develops, was its diversity. In 1700, at the start of the century, the colonies were basically outposts of English culture. Relatively few African people have been brought over yet. The overwhelming majority of white settlers were English. But over the 7 decades leading up to the Revolution, we see more Africans and we see more non-English begin to arrive, and we see the number of people coming from England itself declining. And part of that is because economic conditions in England are improving. So there are fewer people desperate to leave. And also, the English government decided to stop encouraging their own citizens to immigrate to the colonies. In the 1600s, they had been so worried about those landless men, those masterless men. Now, in the 1700s, they're more afraid that if too many of their people leave England itself, that will drain their labor force. Now, poor people continued to go to the colonies as indentured servants, but now they're being joined by skilled craftsmen, by professionals, by teachers and ministers. And for every craftsman, for every carpenter who goes to America, that is one less carpenter in England. And England was worried that it was losing too much good labor. But the government is still convinced that their national power, their wealth, depends on the success of their colonies. So what do? If you don't want you don't want to lose too much of your own labor to the colonies, but you do want the colonies to grow. What they started to do was send more convicts to the American colonies. They sent about 50,000 prisoners to work in the Chesapeake tobacco fields. Of course, the colony of Georgia was founded as sort of a second chance at life for convicts. And England also started to encourage Protestants from other countries to immigrate to their colonies. They promised religious freedom and easy access to land. They even passed a law granting British citizenship for any foreign national who had settled in the colonies for 7 years. In a way, the image of America as a refuge for people fleeing persecution was a byproduct of the British effort to attract settlers from non-English areas in the 1700s. Now, among those migrants came about 145,000 people from Scotland and Northern Ireland. Although Scots and Scotch-Irish were mostly Presbyterian, so they added to the religious diversity of North America. A majority of them came as farmers, but there were also a number of professionals. Most of the doctors in 18th century America were Scottish or of Scottish origin. Now, of those people who weren't neighbors and technically part of the empire, of those new immigrants, Germans made up the largest percentage. About 110,000 people from the German states came. Most of them came from the Rhine Valley, and they usually came to escape religious persecution. Germany was not a unified country at this time. It was made up of little kingdoms and little principalities, and in every one, the local ruler told you what the official religion was. But there are also a lot of wars in the German states where, like, a Catholic prince will invade his Protestant neighbor or vice versa, and then the residents would have to change their religious beliefs or face extreme persecution. And then, of course, if you were a minority Protestant group in the German states, if you were Mennonite or Moravian, you were always going to be persecuted. And so many Germans just kind of got fed up with the violence and the property destruction and the persecution, and they came to America to get a little bit of toleration and get some land that maybe wouldn't be burned to the ground every other year. The Germans tended to travel in entire families. Now, they did come, the majority of them, as indentured servants, but as entire families of indentured servants. They were called the Redemptioners, the German Redemptioners. Once they were free, usually Dad would take extra jobs outside of his indenture contract and save up enough money to buy himself out. And then he would work really hard to buy his wife out early and buy the kids out early, so they don't have to serve their entire contracts. They just serve until everybody can be bought out of those. And once the entire family was free, most of the German Redemptioners settled in what was then considered the frontier area. So central New York, central Pennsylvania, the southern backcountry up in the mountains. They formed German-speaking communities, and for many generations they remained essentially German. There's a lot of diversity growing, but 18th century America isn't a melting pot by any means. Ethnic groups still tended to live and worship in their own communities. But American society was becoming very diverse, and that was most evident in religion. In 1700, nearly all of the churches in the South were Anglican. Almost all of the churches in the North were Congregationalist. But over the next several decades, dissenting congregations multiplied. And remember, in the last lecture, we talked about what dissenting congregations were. They're technically everybody who's not Anglican. So Anabaptists and Methodists, Presbyterians like the Scots, they're all dissenting congregations. Now, most of the colonies did not have a modern separation of church and state. Only Rhode Island and Pennsylvania came close to that. Almost every colony paid ministers for the official church out of people's taxes. Most of them barred Catholics and Jewish people from voting or holding office. But there was an increasing tolerance of different Protestant denominations. New churches were brought over by the immigrants, and new churches arose out of the Great Awakening, which we'll discuss a little bit later. In 1750, a visitor to Philadelphia listed the religious houses that he had seen in the city in one day. He said he had seen a Lutheran church and a Catholic church, the Quaker Meeting House, and churches for Anabaptists, Moravians, Seventh-day Baptists, Presbyterians. He'd seen a Jewish synagogue. He'd seen a mosque. By the mid-1700s, the different regions of the British colonies were all getting new kinds of people, and they were all developing distinct economic and social orders. In New England and in the frontiers, you see mostly small farms that are worked by family labor and geared toward local consumption. The backcountry in particular, where you see these small farms and local consumption, the backcountry was growing very rapidly. In 1730, really the only white residents you would see in the Virginia or Carolina frontier were hunters and merchants. But by the eve of the Revolution, just 40-ish years later, that backcountry contained about a quarter of Virginia's population and half of South Carolina's. Most of these backcountry settlers were farm families, raising grain, raising livestock. But where you found good land in the backcountry, you would also find slave-owning planters. In the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, you do see farms, but the farms tend to be larger, and they're more geared toward commerce. They do grow food for their own families, but they also grow food for the marketplace. They use their own family labor, yes, but they also often supplement the work of their families by hiring wage laborers, tenant farmers, and in some cases by buying slaves. Because large landowners had taken over so much of the good land in New York colony, New York's population growth was starting to lag behind its neighbors. They didn't have so much land to give away anymore. And if you look at a map, the colony of New York is huge. But remember, just 5 families controlled more than 2 million acres of the colony. And so the governor of New York said that only a fool would come to his colony when he could instead go to Pennsylvania and buy good land for not much money. Pennsylvania was known as, one man called it the best poor man's country. And the ordinary colonists, the ordinary settlers, not wealthy settlers in Pennsylvania, had a standard of living that they would have been absolutely unable to achieve back in Europe. During the 1700s, the British surpassed the Dutch as the leading merchants of consumer goods, things like coffee and tea and linen and ceramics. And this trade, this mercantile trade, drew all the different parts of the empire together. The American colonies got drawn more and more into the system of seagoing commerce. And so they start to share in a growing consumer revolution. In the port cities especially, but also in smaller inland towns, we see shops springing up and British merchants supplying colonial peddlers with loans that would let them import more and more goods from around the world. Now, our modern idea of consumerism, with mass production, mass advertising, that obviously didn't exist. But if we look at wills and estate inventories from the 18th century, we can see how widely American colonists, just middle-class American colonists, had access to global products. Things made in Europe, even things made in Asia. In the 1600s, when these colonies were first developing, even wealthy colonists had lived in a pioneer world. Even the wealthy had worn homespun clothes and used homemade goods. But as the 1700s go on, even modest farmers and craftsmen owned ceramic plates and metal utensils and clothes of imported silk and cotton and books, and tea used to be a luxury only for the wealthy. But as the 1700s go on, it becomes virtually a necessity of colonial life. Britain's mainland colonies were mostly agricultural, really overwhelmingly agricultural. 90% of the population still lived in rural areas, and they still made their living from farming. Colonial cities, like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, were quite small by European standards. Mostly they were still there, certainly at the start of the 1700s, still there as gathering places for the raw materials of the colonies. But as the expansion of trade continued, that encouraged port cities to grow. And those port cities, including Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia, became home to an increasing number of merchants and skilled craftsmen. By 1770, Philadelphia was considered kind of the capital of the British New World. It had 30,000 people, which was quite large back then. It was the empire's third busiest port, and it was the financial and cultural center of the colonies. Philadelphia merchants organized the collection of these raw materials and farm goods. They supplied shopkeepers in the rural areas. They gave credit to consumers so they could buy more. The city of Philadelphia and most of the port cities was also becoming home to a large population of jewelers and silversmiths and goldsmiths and furniture makers who served a growing class of wealthy citizens. It's also home to hundreds of lesser artisans like weavers and blacksmiths, construction workers. The typical artisan owned his own tools, worked in a small workshop that he himself owned. He would be helped by his family members and also by young apprentices who had been given to him by their parents so that he could help them learn that trade. And the master craftsman's skill set him apart from common laborers, and that was seen as the key to his independence, his economic freedom. A printer's apprentice named Ben Franklin wrote that he that hath a trade can have an estate, because those skilled artisans answered to nobody but their customers. Now, American craftsmen benefit a little bit from the expanding consumer marketplace, but American craftsmen are never really supported by the British government. Parliament would strongly prefer that American colonists buy finished products from English craftsmen, not from colonial craftsmen. But still, with such an expansion of trade going on, that does open up some room for craftsmen in the colonies. Most journeymen had a reasonable chance of becoming master craftsmen and having a workshop of their own, and some achieved remarkable success. This Atlantic commerce, this seagoing trade, knitted together the empire and all of its parts. As trade expanded, the North American colonies and Britain's Caribbean colonies became the major overseas market for British manufactured goods. Most of the output of the colonies was consumed close to home, but North America was still shipping a lot of raw material to England. Virtually the entire Chesapeake tobacco crop was marketed in Britain, and then it would be re-exported to Europe by British merchants. Most of the bread and flour from the North American colonies went to the West Indies. African slaves in the West Indies grew sugar, which could be distilled into rum, which was increasingly popular in the mainland North American colonies. There is some grumbling about the mercantilist system, that system that required the colonies to focus on raw materials. But at this point, it's not unbearable. And American shipping is protected by the Royal Navy. Merchants did appreciate that. So they're grumbling about it, but they're still willing to live with it. Most free Americans benefited from economic growth. But as colonial society matured and stabilized, an elite class grew. And those elites will increasingly dominate politics and society. The gap between rich and poor grew more rapidly in 18th century America than just about any other period of American history. In New England and the middle colonies, the expansion of trade made it possible to create a very powerful class of merchants who were often linked by family ties to Britain itself. They kind of had to be. There were no banks in colonial America at this point, and cash money was very rare. So if you wanted to be a merchant, you wanted to be involved in commerce, your success would depend as much on your personal connections as on your business talent. Now the South, by 1750, the colonies in the Chesapeake and the lower South were dominated by slave plantations, producing particularly tobacco and rice, these staple crops for the world market. And in those southern colonies, the big planters built up enormous wealth. Now, the colonies had no aristocracy, right? Nobody actually has a title. We don't have legally established social ranks that go back to the medieval period. And apart from a handful of families, no one here had the massive land holdings that could rival the real British aristocracy. But throughout British America, men of prominence wanted to see themselves as aristocrats. They controlled colonial government. Like in Virginia, the upper class was so close knit and intermarried so often that the colony was said to be not an aristocracy, but a cousinocracy. Members of the landed gentry controlled the churches, they dominated the county courts, they filled the legislature. In the 1750s, 7 members of one generation of the Lee family sat in the House of Burgesses. Now, Virginia in the 1700s was much healthier than it had been in the early days of settlement. And so planters could expect to live long enough to have children and live long enough to build up an estate that they could pass down to the next generation. And they did that. Nearly every Virginian of any prominence at all in the 1700s got that through his family connections. In the 1600s, Virginia was not an equal society by any means, but it was possible for poor men to come over, even to come over as indentured servants, and if they survive, work hard and build up wealth. But the 1700s, the days when self-made men could rise up, were kind of over. By 1770, nearly all upper-class Virginians had inherited their wealth. Thomas Jefferson's grandfather had been a justice of the peace, which was super important in the colonial days. His grandfather had also been a militia captain and a sheriff. His father had been a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. George Washington's father and grandfather and great-grandfather had all been justices of the peace. The Virginia gentry used their control of the local governments to get big tracts of land as every new piece was opened up. If you were very well connected to the governor and the members of the House of Burgesses, it was not unusual for you to get grants of 20 to 40,000 acres just in one swoop. Robert Carter was the Speaker of the House of Burgesses for about 17 years, and by the time he died, he had built up 300,000 acres of land. For most of the 1700s, the American colonies had more communication and more contact with Britain itself than they had with each other. The elites in the different regions of the colonies had a common lifestyle and common interests that they shared. But rather than thinking of themselves as Americans, they thought of themselves very much as English. They are stubbornly Anglicizing themselves. Wealthy Americans wanted to model their lives on the lives of British aristocrats. They wanted to use British etiquette. Some of them seemed to resent living in isolation in the provinces. At the end of the world is how one Virginia aristocrat put it. So they tried to demonstrate their status and tried to demonstrate that they were just as good as British aristocracy by wearing the latest London fashions, importing the newest literature, and sending their sons to Britain for education, building homes that were modeled on the estates of the British nobility. Some colonial elites, like George Washington, even had fake coats of arms designed for their families. Washington was also famous for only wearing clothing that was made in England itself. The father of our country would not, until the Revolution came, wear clothing made by mere colonial tailors. If you visit Mount Vernon, um, in part of the museum there, they've got a copy of a letter that he sent to a British merchant, absolutely berating this man for sending him last year's coat style. The coat style that George Washington wanted had slightly longer cuffs, and this man had sent him last year's style. And how dare this merchant think that just because Washington lives, in provincial isolation, how dare he imagine that Washington doesn't know what the latest fashion is? That was not unusual, actually. Washington maybe took it a little farther uh, than some other planters did, but it was not unusual for American planters, American aristocrats, as they would like to think of themselves, to really try to be as fashionable and as with it and a la mode as they could. You've probably all heard the song Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. And you may have wondered, what? What could that possibly mean? A macaroni is this guy in the picture. A macaroni was the slang term for exceedingly fashionable young gentlemen in England in the mid 1700s. The guys who were very specific, you roll your stockings down just so. You wear the correct kind of cravat and you only tie it in certain ways. And your hair has to be powdered just perfectly. They're dandies, basically. A Yankee Doodle dandy, though, is mocking colonial aristocrats, mocking men like George Washington, and saying, "Oh, Yankee Doodle is such a hick, right? They're such bumpkins out there in Virginia that they think all they have to do to be fashionable is stick a feather in their hat. They think that's good enough. Ha ha." George Washington hated that song. There's a story, and I don't know if this is true, but I love this story, so I hope it's true. The story is that when Washington defeated General Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown, that the only requirement he had before allowing Cornwallis to take all of his men and leave was don't play Yankee Doodle. Many planters are kind of desperate to live up to this aristocratic lifestyle, and some of them fall into extreme debt. William Byrd lived so extravagantly. He was a tobacco planter in Virginia. He lived so extravagantly that by 1770 he'd racked up about 100,000 pounds sterling in debt, which was unheard of in the colonies or in England itself at the time. But the richest group of mainland colonists were the Carolina planters, the ones who were planting rice. Elite South Carolinians especially. They would often travel north for their summer vacations, and they would go to Saratoga Springs, and they'd go to Boston, and they'd go to places like that because it gets really hot in South Carolina in the summer. And then in the winter they would go back to Charleston, but they wouldn't really leave the city. They'd just kind of stay there. The South Carolina planters hardly ever went to their actual plantations. In the cities, their social life centered on theaters and literary societies and balls, and they live a very lavish lifestyle, like the planters in Virginia. But the planters in South Carolina are making so much more money from the rice that they don't go into debt at quite the same rate that Virginia planters do. Now, they will import everything. They will import furniture and wine and clothing and decorative items. They would surround themselves with house slaves who were dressed in specially designed uniforms so everybody would know who they belonged to. But the per capita wealth in the Charleston district was 4 times higher than it was in the wealthiest tobacco district of Virginia. It was 8 times higher than the wealth of Philadelphia or Boston. But wealth in South Carolina was highly concentrated. Only a few people had The richest 10% of the colony owned half the property by 1770. The poorest quarter of the colony, well, the poorest free quarter of the colony, owned only 2% of the land. Now, all over the colonies, the elites would try to copy what they saw as Britain's stable, balanced social order. In their eyes, liberty still meant the power to rule. It still meant the right of those blessed with wealth and prominence to dominate other people. They viewed society as still this hierarchical structure, where some men were just endowed with greater talents than others, and were therefore destined to rule. And of course, you could tell who was endowed with the most talent by who had the wealthiest father. They tried to cultivate this image of refinement to prove to themselves that they deserved that wealth and power. The elites in the colonies prided themselves on having aristocratic manners and an appreciation for art, and productively using their leisure time to learn Latin and learn philosophy, and that was part of being the elite. Now, at the other end of the social scale, poverty as a distinct class became really visible in colonial life. The growing numbers of slaves obviously lived in impoverished conditions. Among free Americans, poverty was not as widespread as it was in Britain. In Britain, throughout the 1700s, the poverty rate could fluctuate between a quarter and half of the population. It was never that bad here. But as the colonial population grows, access to land starts to fall, especially in the areas that had been settled for a while. In New England, the high birth rate fueled massive population growth, and with the supply of land drying up, the new generations who can't hope to get land, they're forced to move to other colonies or learn a trade and become landless wage earners. By the middle of the century, tenant farmers and wage laborers were a growing presence in New England and in the middle colonies. In colonial cities, the number of these landless wage earners who lived kind of on the edge of poverty increased pretty steadily. In Boston, by 1771, a third of the population owned no property. In rural Virginia, every time new pieces of land would open up, it would almost immediately be snatched up by men who were already wealthy. And so by the 1760s, 2/3 of the white men on the Virginia frontier owned no land and had no chance at getting it. Taking the colonies as a whole, half of the wealth at mid-century was concentrated into the hands of the richest 10%. And that 10%, the wealthy colonists, they viewed everyone who wasn't wealthy as lazy and shiftless and responsible for their own problems. Now, sometimes communities would take on responsibility for helping folks who were falling through the cracks. But to minimize the burden on taxpayers, poor people were often set to work in workhouses. So if your family is fallen on hard times, particularly if dad has died and now mom has to raise the kids, mom will get sent to the workhouse. She will make something. She will make silverware, she will make porcelain, or she'll make some kind of product along with everyone else who works and lives in that workhouse. And then that will be sold collectively to pay for the upkeep of everyone who lives there. And probably the children won't be there. Probably the children will be taken away. Girls will be sent to work as maids. Boys will be taken and sent into apprenticeships with master craftsmen. And I know that sounds tragic, but that's, in the 1700s, that's not a terrible outcome. The hope is, your son will learn that craft, and when he becomes an adult, he'll be a master craftsman, and then he can buy you out of the workhouse, and he can maybe provide a dowry for his sisters. That's the hope, that's the good outcome there. But a lot of communities also had strict rules to keep the unemployed and the landless from becoming dependent. Sometimes they would banish people from their towns. And many of these poor households that are being banished are female-headed households. They're headed by widows or by abandoned women. Essex County, Massachusetts, saw a dramatic increase in the number of families that they banished from the county throughout the 1700s. In the 1730s, they were banishing an average of 200-ish a year. By the 1760s, they were banishing 1,700 families a year, and almost all of them were female-headed households. Now, we've talked about the extremes. We've talked about the macaronis, the wannabe macaronis, the wealthy, and we've talked about the people who are in poverty. But the large majority of free Americans did not live in the extremes. The large majority of free Americans had really very stable, what they would consider middle rank lives, along with the diversity that we already talked about. One of the things that distinguished the mainland colonies from Europe was that the fact that there was a wide distribution of land, and generally most families could experience some economic freedom. About 2/3 of the free male population across the colonies were farmers who owned at least some land. Now, again, individual colonies could sometimes differ. We talked about Virginia, where 2/3 of the freemen didn't own any land at all. But then you look at a place like Pennsylvania, where upwards of 90% of the freemen owned at least 50 acres of land. Now, in England, that really wouldn't have been possible for most of these folks. Throughout the 1700s, a solid 60% of men owned no land at all. So you come to the colonies, you've got, depending on where you go, a better chance. By the middle of the 1700s, these colonial farm families, who make up the largest part of the population, they view land ownership as a right, as the foundation of their independence and their freedom. And they strongly resent anything that limits their access to land, whether that limit is being put in place by the colonial government, by landlords, or by native people. They have a really strong dislike of personal dependence. Their understanding of freedom is to not rely on someone else for a livelihood. And that understanding was based in the reality that a majority of these English colonists had. A majority had pretty wide distribution of property that made economic independence a part of their lived experience. The family was the center of economic life for most of these farmers. The majority of work revolved around the home, and all members of the family were expected to contribute to the family's livelihood. The high birth rate, in part, reflected a need to have as many hands on deck as possible on colonial farms. But most farmers concentrated first on growing food for their own families, and then getting enough land to pass it along to their sons. But the consumer revolution and the expanding trade networks drew increasing numbers of even small farmers into production for the global marketplace. As the population grew and life expectancy increased, family life became a lot more stable than it had been in the 1600s. Marriages lasted much longer. Male domination, which was already in the law, that took on greater social reality. In several colonies, laws were passed that required estates be passed only to the eldest son, rather than between all of the sons, or in some cases sort of unofficially to all of the children. Now it is only going to be passed to the oldest son. As colonial society became more structured, opportunities that used to exist for women in the 1600s goes away. We talked about the loss of women's businesses when the New Netherlands became New York. We talked about opportunities available for women in the Chesapeake colonies because there had been such a massive um, difference in the ratio between men and women. And now in other colonies, we see a tightening of the social rules. Like in Connecticut, in the 1600s, the courts in Connecticut had been very informal and like loosely organized, and women often represented themselves. But in the 1700s, it became necessary to hire a lawyer. Things got a lot more formal, and all the lawyers were men. And so women disappear from the practice, really, of law. Back in the 1600s, there was such a desperate need for labor that you could find men and women both doing all kinds of work. But in the 1700s, there's more of a division of labor. But even as the consumer revolution reduced some demands on women by making it possible to buy things that they used to have to make themselves, women's work still seemed to increase. Lower infant mortality meant more time spent in childcare and domestic chores. The demand for money to buy all of these new goods increased the need for all family members to contribute to the family income. And so for most women, even though you have to spend less time doing those things, you have to spend more time doing these other things. By the mid-1700s, the area that will become the United States was home to just a remarkable diversity of people, different kinds of social organizations, but generally, you could expect that the elite will dominate the political and economic life of every colony. Free colonists in general probably enjoyed the highest per capita income in the world. Large numbers of colonists enjoyed a lot more opportunity for freedom than they would have had in Europe, whether that's access to land or religious toleration. The colony's economic growth contributed to sort of an expansion of freedom for these European colonists coming in. But many other people found themselves confined to the partial freedom, still of indentured servitude, or the complete absence of freedom in slavery. And both the desire for freedom and these forms of unfreedom were essential to the development of the North American colonies. Sometime in the mid-1750s, this young man, Olaudah Equiano, was kidnapped by slave traders. He was 11 years old when they caught him, but it took 6 or 7 months to march him from where he had been captured to the West African coast. When he arrived in the Americas, he was 12 years old. The ship first went to Barbados, to the sugar plantations there. Most slave ships went to the sugar islands first because they had such a constant need for new labor. But because he was so small, nobody there bought him. And he was put back on the boat and sent to Virginia, where he was eventually purchased by a tobacco planter. And then that dude sold him, and he was bought and sold several more times. And over the course of his enslavement, he learned to read and write in English and Spanish, and eventually earned enough money to buy himself. And then Equiano went on to have all sorts of adventures. He was part of this group that tried to colonize Central America. He was part of a group that tried to reach the Arctic Circle, but he's most famous for writing his autobiography. Equiano eventually settled in London, and in the 1780s he published his narrative, his slave narrative. In that book, he kind of took a new direction in talking about slavery. Equiano's autobiography was not the first slave narrative ever published, not by a long shot. There had been an extremely popular one published just about 10 years before his. But the vast majority of the slave narratives published before his kind of had this theme of how horrible this thing was that happened to me. Like the popular one that had been published about a decade before had been written by a man who grew up in a very wealthy North African family. His was a merchant family. His family owned slaves. He could read and write in Arabic and a couple of other languages. And when he was captured and sold into slavery, he very much felt that that shouldn't have happened to him. And in fact, when his purchaser in Virginia realized that he was a literate man, and was able to eventually communicate with him and find out that this guy was from a wealthy family, his owner immediately freed him and sent him back to his family in North Africa. And so his book had been all about, this should never have happened to me. I am the wrong kind of person for this to have happened to. How dare the world, put me through this? Equianos didn't focus on himself so much. He talked about his life and the things that he had experienced. He also talked a lot about the other people that he had met as slaves. And the theme of his book is not how terrible this thing is that happened to me. It's how terrible this thing is when it happens to anyone. He points out that he was able to learn to read and write, and he became a successful businessman, and he became a respected member of the community. But he says that any slave could have done that. He's not special. He condemned the idea that Africans were inferior and deserved to be slaves. He said that everyone, regardless of race, had God-given intellectual talents, had things that they were supposed to accomplish, and that the great sin of slavery is that it interferes with their ability to develop those talents and accomplish what they were set on earth to do. His book became the most widely read slave narrative of this century, and it became the inspiration for that last final push of the British abolition movement. Equiano didn't live to see that, but his work also revitalized the American abolition movement. It brought, before this, the Quakers had kind of been the only white folks that were involved in abolition, but his work, which went through multiple printings in the American colonies, brought a lot of non-Quakers into the abolitionist fold. His life also illustrates a lot of the patterns of 18th century American history. This is a period of intense development, but also growing connections with the rest of the world. As Equiano's life shows, the Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier between the old world and the new world. It's a bridge. Ideas and people and stuff flowed back and forth across the ocean. Even while the colony's population was growing and becoming more diverse, the colonies were increasingly drawn into imperial issues. The laws and the institutions of the colonies are extensions of British law and institutions. The economies of the colonies are geared to serving the British Empire's needs. And Equiano's life also underscores the biggest contradiction in the history of the 1700s, an expansion of freedom alongside an expansion of slavery. But this is the century when the idea of the freeborn Englishman became firmly entrenched in the colonial mind. This liberty was seen as the reason why the British Empire was distinct and unique and special. But this is also the era of the height of the Atlantic slave trade, which is increasingly dominated by British merchants and British ships. One of the most popular patriotic songs, Hail, Hail Britannia, includes the line, "Britons never, never, never will be slaves," but more than half of the slaves shipped to the New World during this century were carried on British ships with British crews. Most of them, like we talked about, went to the West Indies or Brazil, but they also made up about half of the mainland immigrants between 1700 and 1775. Now, slavery might have been concentrated in the South, but it existed in every British colony. And unlike Equiano, very few slaves were fortunate enough to gain their freedom. An estimated 7.5-ish million Africans arrived in the New World between 1492 and 1820. Over half of them came in this one century. And the Atlantic slave trade eventually was condemned as a crime against humanity, but in the 1700s, it was just seen as business. It's just a regular business practice where European merchants and African traders and American planters bargain over human life to turn a profit. The slave trade was a vital part of world commerce in the 1700s. Every European empire in the New World used slave labor and fought to control the trade. And when Britain gained that control, that was a major step on their rise to becoming the major commercial power. In the British colonies at this time, free wage workers were still pretty rare. Slavery was the norm. Slave plantations contributed to English wealth. The first mass consumer goods in international trade were produced by slaves. Things like sugar and rice and coffee and tobacco. The demand for those products fueled the growth of the slave trade. Sugar was by far the most important product of the British and French and Portuguese empires, and New World sugar plantations produced immense profits for planters and merchants and the imperial governments. Haiti, which in the 1700s was known as Saint-Domingue, Haiti was like the jewel in the French Empire. Throughout the 1700s, tiny little Barbados generated more trade for the British Empire than all of their other colonies combined, all because of sugar. In the 18th century, the Caribbean is the commercial focus of the British Empire and the major producer of revenue for the crown. So, of course, the British government is going to be heavily invested in the slave trade to grow that sugar. And slave-grown products from the mainland are also starting to occupy a larger part of Atlantic commerce. A series of triangular trading routes crisscross the Atlantic, carrying British manufactured goods to Africa to be traded for slaves, who would be sent to the colonies to produce the raw materials, which would be sent to England, turned into these manufactured products. Merchants in New York and Massachusetts and Rhode Island were active participants in the slave trade because they owned the ships. Every colony was complicit in the slave trade. New England made a lot of money shipping slaves and also shipping fish and grain and lumber to slave colonies. In 1720, half the ships entering or leaving New York Harbor were involved with the slave trade. The growth and the prosperity of free colonial America was built on the backs of slaves. And Britain itself benefited. The port cities of Bristol and Liverpool were built in their modern forms on money from the slave trade. The money for the first industrial revolution was generated by the slave trade. In the 1700s, Atlantic commerce consisted mostly of slaves and crops produced by slaves and goods that were heading to slave societies. So it shouldn't surprise you to understand that for many free colonists, they believed that their freedom rested on the ability to enslave others. As slavery became more entrenched, so too did the idea that slavery was connected with a particular race. For slaves, the voyage across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, was a horrific experience. A slave could be sold in the colonies for 20 or 30 times the price that they were bought for in Africa. So men and women and children were crammed on these ships as tightly as possible to maximize profits. Because after all, if one lives and 10 die, the shipper still makes a profit. The death rate was usually not quite that bad, but an average of 15 to 20% of captives died during the Middle Passage. In the early years of the trade, mortality rates could hit 50%. By the late 1700s, when things have become more stable and efficient, the death rate falls considerably. Slave merchants did everything they could to maximize the number of people that they could fit on their ships. One trader wrote very proudly of a boat that he had had built to his specifications, just to fit as many people as possible on there. He said that he had designed it so that the height between decks was only 18 inches. I don't know if you've seen particularly large men, their shoulders can be broader than 18 inches, which means that they can't turn over. They can't even turn onto their sides. And the merchant goes on to talk about having them chained to the decks by their legs and necks. So that's fun. The length of time that people would spend in that condition depended on the time of year that they were sailing, because the winds blow faster at sometimes than others, and on where they were going. You could generally make it from about Sierra Leone to Brazil in about a month. It's pretty much the shortest amount of time. If you wanted to go to the Caribbean or to Virginia, that would take 2 months in good conditions and longer in bad conditions. So 2 months chained by the legs and necks in 18 inches. The Middle Passage was physically dangerous, and it was psychologically traumatic. Ships were horribly overcrowded. The decks weren't cleaned out by sailors, and the captives were chained and not able to do it themselves, so we're talking 2 months of feces and urine and blood and vomit. Captives were fed once or twice a day, assuming that they could eat, but they weren't fed well. The severe overcrowding bred disease, dysentery, which causes diarrhea, typhoid, which causes diarrhea and vomiting, measles, smallpox, yellow fever. Dehydration was always a problem. They didn't usually have enough fresh water even for the sailors, let alone for the captains. And dehydration aggravated the heat of overcrowding and the symptoms of disease. Women and girls were assaulted by the ship's crew. And the trip produced really predictable, I think, psychological outcomes among those who survived. Depression, shock, what now we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a field of biology called epigenetics that is still kind of in the developmental phases today. The underlying hypothesis behind this is that trauma can alter your DNA. This is such an extreme trauma that it's essentially taking free people and changing their DNA based on these horrific experiences. Between the start of European encroachment on the Americas in 1492 and the end of the Atlantic slave trade, Europeans kidnapped a minimum of 10 million Africans to the Americas, averaged 170 slave ships a year. At its height, 80,000 people a year were being kidnapped. About 95% of those people were sent to brutal labor in the sugar-growing regions of Brazil and the Caribbean, worked to an early death. Think about this, minimum 10 million kidnapped and put on the ships. 15 to 20% death rate overall. 20% of 10 million is 2 million. What happened to those 2 million people? Where are they? They left Africa. They did not arrive here. The Atlantic Ocean is a graveyard for at least 2 million human beings. By 1770, 20% of the mainland colonial population was African or African descended. In some colonies, like Virginia and South Carolina, that number was closer to 50%. And by the middle of the 1700s, three very different and distinct slave labor systems had developed in the mainland colonies. There was, well, first you got tobacco-based plantation slavery. That's in the Chesapeake. Second, you got rice-based plantation slavery. You'll find that in South Carolina and Georgia. And third, you've got non-plantation slavery, which you can find all over, but especially in the cities and then in the northern colonies. The largest and the oldest of these slave labor systems was the tobacco plantation system in the Chesapeake. In those two colonies, in just Virginia and Maryland, more than 270,000 slaves made up about half the population by the time the Revolution starts. Virginia and Maryland were as closely tied to Britain as any other colony, and their economies were these perfect little models of mercantilist policy. They supplied the mother country with valuable raw materials. They imported huge amounts of British goods. They're closely linked in culture and political values. And as we talked about, the period after Bacon's Rebellion saw a rapid shift away from indentured servitude toward slavery on these tobacco plantations. As Virginia expanded westward, so did slavery. By the eve of the Revolution, the center of slavery had shifted from the coast toward the inland region. Most Chesapeake slaves worked in the gang system. That means they're working in the fields in gangs of usually about 20 people under constant supervision. Usually a gang would work under the supervision of a slave driver, and then multiple gangs with multiple slave drivers would be overseen by the overseer. And that's where the vast majority of Chesapeake slaves worked. Now, a couple thousand also worked as teamsters and boatmen, dairymaids, personal servants, with the vast majority of working in the gang system in the tobacco fields. Now, slavery was common in the Chesapeake on small farms as well as on big plantations. Nearly half of Virginia's white families owned at least one slave in 1770. But tobacco plantations tended to be kind of small. Tobacco doesn't have economy of scale. Economy of scale means that the bigger your operation is, the more efficient that you can be. Tobacco planting doesn't do that. So plantations in the Chesapeake tended to be considerably smaller than sugar plantations or rice plantations. And because of that, because the Chesapeake plantations tended to be smaller, you had a lot more daily interaction between owner and slave. That slavery was how the Chesapeake elite came to dominate the society and the politics of their region. The Consumer Revolution had improved access to goods for poor white colonists, but it had limited their long-term economic prospects because planters increasingly used the best land and the wealth became more and more concentrated. Slavery transformed Chesapeake society into this elaborate hierarchy with different degrees of freedom. At the top, you've got the big planters. Then you've got the lesser planters, folks who own land, but not a whole lot. Then at the bottom, you've got a large population of convicts, still some indentured servants and tenant farmers, and of course, slaves. Now, the planters are already powerful, and they use their power to get more power. They filled the law books with laws that were designed to enhance their power over their human property and to restrict or just eliminate any pathway to freedom. And race took on more and more importance as this line of social division. White settlers increasingly considered free black people to be undesirable and dangerous. And so free black people lost the ability to hire white servants. They lost the ability to own weapons. They were subject to special taxes. They could be punished for striking a white person, even in self-defense. We talked about in Lecture 2 how in the 1600s, free African Americans sometimes were able to build up property, and if they built up enough, they could vote. But in 1723, the colony of Virginia revoked that. Didn't matter how much land you owned, if you were black, you couldn't vote. And Parliament in London demanded to know how Virginia could justify discriminating against free men, they said, merely upon account of their complexion. The governor of Virginia colony said that a distinction must be made between the offspring of white men and the offspring of Africans. They must never be accounted equal, he said. By the time of that disagreement, the law in Virginia also required that any newly freed slaves, former slaves, be sent out of the colony. So the population of free people of color in Virginia remained tiny. It was less than 4% of the population in 1750. And so in Virginia, free came to mean white. Further south, we're going to go down to particularly South Carolina and Georgia. We've got a different labor system that's based on rice production. Those sons of Barbados, who had originally settled in South Carolina in the 1670s, they are already very familiar with owning African slaves. But their original victims when they got here were the natives of the area, many of whom they enslaved and sent to the islands. The early Carolina economy focused on the export of Indian slaves and then the fur trade with tribes who were not enslaved. Just like in early Virginia, in the early days of Carolina, the frontier, rough conditions had allowed those African-born slaves to have a little bit of leeway. So at first, for a couple of decades, they were allowed to be in the Carolina militia to help fight off the Spanish. But just like with Virginia, when Carolina introduced a staple crop, a marketable staple crop, that led directly to an economic boom, the large-scale importation of slaves, and consequently a growing divide between black and white. South Carolina was the first mainland colony to have a slave majority. By the 1730s, 2/3 of its population was enslaved. I guess kind of ironically, it was those slaves who taught the English colonists how to grow their staple crop, how to grow the rice. There's a form of rice that is native to West Africa. It's grown along the river deltas. Rice needs to be flooded, and West Africa is geographically perfect for this. There's a range of mountains just off the coast. When the snow melts, it runs into the deltas of the Niger River, the Senegal, the Gambia. And when the slaves arrived in South Carolina, they recognized that the South Carolina low country is also superb for flooding. So they're the ones who taught plantation owners how to grow rice in Carolina. Now, rice planting does have economy of scale. If you're going to put the work in for 40 acres, you might as well put the work in for 400. It will just get that much more efficient. So rice plantations tended to be significantly larger than tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake River. South Carolina planters especially owned much more land and many more slaves than planters in the Chesapeake did. But they had less contact with their slaves. Malaria was rampant in the rice fields because standing water. So planters often didn't go to their plantations at all. They would leave their plantations under the control of overseers, and they would spend all their time in Charleston or up north. So we talked about the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake in the tobacco fields. Field slaves would work in gangs under constant supervision. In the rice fields in Carolina and Georgia, that's not really possible. In South Carolina and Georgia, what you get instead is known as the task system. In the task system, individual slaves would get a list of tasks, jobs that must be completed within a certain amount of time. You need to do this, this, and this, and it has to be done in 2 weeks. Well, if you do this, this, and this in the first week, then that second week is just your time to do what you want within the constraints of the plantation. But within the task system, there is not constant supervision. There's just not enough white people to do that. Not enough white people to oversee the vast numbers of slaves. Like in one rice district in the 1760s, the census showed more than 1,000 slaves and only 72 white people, and half of them were children. So constant supervision isn't possible in the rice fields. By 1770, South Carolina as a whole had more than 100,000 slaves. White South Carolina was a little afraid of this increasing black majority. They're afraid of the possibility of a slave rebellion, but they're not going to stop enslaving people. Now, compared to the plantation regions, slavery was far less widespread in the middle colonies and New England. Those colonies absolutely benefited from the trade in slaves, but slaves themselves were usually only a minor part of those colonies' populations. It was unusual for even rich families in the North to own more than a couple of slaves. Northern slaves were a lot more dispersed, a lot more spread out than in the South. But slavery was still important to Northern colonial life. Slaves worked as farmhands. They worked in craftsmen's shops. They worked on the docks. They worked as personal servants. In the early 1700s, about 3/4 of the Northern elite owned a slave. But with slaves such a small part of the population, they didn't seem to pose a threat to the white majority. And so laws in the North were usually less harsh than in the South. Like in Massachusetts, slaves made up less than 3% of the population, and so slaves could sue in court. They could testify against white people. That was unheard of in Carolina or Virginia or Georgia. Now, slavery had been present in New York from the earliest days of Dutch settlement. The large landholders and even the small farmers and craftsmen imported considerable amounts of slave labor. And as New York City's role in shipping grew, so did slavery grow inside the city. In 1746, about 20% of New York City's population was enslaved. Most of them were domestic servants, but there were slaves working in all sectors of the economy. About 10% of New Jersey was enslaved. Slavery was also significant in Philadelphia, despite the fact that, Pennsylvania was originally a Quaker colony. Slavery became less important in Pennsylvania as more white immigrants came in, but it did still exist. Now, all of these slaves, nearly 300,000 Africans, were brought to the mainland colonies during the 1700s. And they're not a single people. Remember, Africa is a massive continent, not a country. So they come from lots of different cultures. They speak many different languages. They practice different religions. We use the term melting pot to usually talk about European immigrants becoming Americanized. But probably the most successful melting pot in American history was creating an African-American people from the Africans who were transported here to be slaves. Slavery threw people together who would never have encountered each other otherwise, and who would never have considered the color of their skin or the continent of their origin to be a source of identity or unity. The bonds that they built here were not based on kinship or language or really even race. They were built on the conditions that they were forced to live and work in. Now, the process of creating a cohesive culture and a community took many years, and in the different regions, it happened at kind of different speeds. But broadly, by about 1800, few slaves identified themselves as Igbo or Ashanti or Fon. they identified themselves as Americans. And in music and art and language and religion, they created new cultures as this synthesis of African tradition, European elements, and the new conditions that they lived in America. For most of the 1700s, the majority of African slaves were African by birth. They were born as free people. And even after being captured and brought here, for many years they would continue to speak their own language, their first language, and when they could, practice their traditional religions. Advertisements about runaways in the 1700s often described them by their African origin, looking for a Bambara man or a Fulani woman, and described them as having what Europeans called country marks, things like tattoos or stretched earlobes that would mark them as a member of a particular family or village at home. Throughout the 1700s, there was a kind of re-Africanization, as slaves who were born in the colonies were constantly outnumbered by new arrivals from Africa. So like a booster shot of different West African cultures happening all the time. By the mid-1700s, the different slave labor systems in British North America had produced different African American cultures. In the Chesapeake, in the tobacco gang labor region, because it had an increasingly healthy climate, remember 1600s very bad, 1700s it's getting better. Because the climate is getting healthier, the slave population in the Chesapeake began to reproduce itself. People had children, and those children survived to adulthood. And that created a much more balanced sex ratio than we had seen in the 1600s. And that, in turn, made it possible for slaves in the Chesapeake to create family-based communities. The Chesapeake tobacco region is the first place where slaves were able to create those family-based communities. Because most of the Chesapeake farms and plantations were small, and because there were a lot of small white farmers who owned a few slaves, slaves in the Chesapeake were constantly exposed to English culture. So they learned to speak English relatively quickly. Many of them converted to Christianity, got swept up in the revivals of the Great Awakening, which we'll talk about in a bit. Further south, though, it's a different story. You go to the rice plantations, the task-based rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, different. On those rice plantations, the slaves lived in extremely harsh conditions. The birth rate was very low. The infant mortality rate was very high throughout the 1700s. That meant that it was very difficult to have families. And throughout the 1700s, planters constantly imported new labor from Africa. The slaves in the rice fields rarely came into contact with white people. They do have a little more day-to-day autonomy than slaves in the Chesapeake because they're not usually working under overseers. The larger structure of their lives was established by slavery. But because they lacked that constant oversight, they were able to maintain a little more of their traditions than slaves in the Chesapeake could. So they built houses in their traditional styles, depending on where they were from in West Africa. They would build their houses in that style. When their children survived, which did sometimes happen, they would choose names for those children based on their own languages, and they would continue to speak their own languages for decades. They also created a new language. Slaves in the rice districts in South Carolina and Georgia created a language called Gullah. That language mixed several different West African languages with a little bit of English that they had picked up, because they're coming from all of these different backgrounds. They're coming from different ethnic groups and from different parts of West Africa, usually. They don't speak the same language when they first come into contact with each other, but they have to complete these tasks on time or everybody gets punished. So that means they have to communicate in some way. And they develop this language, they create a brand new language to be able to communicate and complete those tasks. Now, slaves in the rice districts had a very hard time creating families, creating communities that bridged generations. We won't really see family-based communities being developed in the rice districts until the late 1700s, early 1800s, because the conditions are just so appalling. So we've talked about the Chesapeake tobacco plantations, the first to develop a family-based community. Now we've just finished talking about the rice-based task labor plantations, where it was difficult to have families, but slaves retained more of their traditions. And then we've got that third labor system, that non-plantation system. And especially in the North, that also creates a different African American culture. Slaves who worked in cities, and especially those who worked in the northern colonies, assimilated the most quickly into European American culture. In the northern colonies, where slaves were owned in small units and where they lived right with whites, they did enjoy a little more mobility and a little more access to mainstream society than slaves in either of the southern regions would have. But because there were so few of them, they don't have as many opportunities to create a stable family life or any kind of cohesive community. You know, if there's one slave in this town, you can't really build a community based on yourself. Now, each of these different cultures that's growing were all linked by the experience of slavery and the desire for freedom. Throughout the 1700s, black people risked their lives to resist slavery. Colonial newspapers, especially in the South, were filled with advertisements for runaways. And most of the runaways were young men who had only recently arrived from Africa. So they're the guys who don't have any families here yet and have, like, nothing to lose. In the Deep South, in Carolina and Georgia, they tended to run to the Florida swamps, where the Seminole Nation would take them in. In the Upper South, they would run to the cities. They would try to run to the cities and pass for free. The colonial officials complained about a dangerous spirit of liberty among the slaves. The first slave uprising of the 1700s happened in New York City in 1712. A group of slaves, allegedly, set fire to houses on the outskirts of the city so that the people would be, the free residents of New York would be distracted by the fire, and then they were going to use that distraction to seize some ships and try to run away. 18 of them were executed. Some of them were burned at the stake in an attempt to intimidate the rest of the slave population. Throughout the 1700s, whenever England was at war with another empire, that opened the door to slave resistance, because the militia and the white population would be distracted by the official war. So there were uprisings in the West Indies. There was a massive uprising in Jamaica. Communities of fugitive slaves just waged outright warfare against the British authorities and eventually got a treaty that recognized their freedom. Slaves in South Carolina seized the opportunity to rebel when England was briefly at war with Spain. In 1739, a group of slaves in South Carolina, who were all recent arrivals from the Congo and had all been prisoners of war, aka soldiers, before they were sold into slavery, they were all bought by one idiot slave owner who put these former soldiers to work guarding a storehouse full of weapons in Stono, South Carolina. And they just immediately broke into the storehouse and took the weapons and started marching south toward Florida. They were headed to Florida because Spain promised freedom for all fugitive British slaves. And eventually they'd gathered up about 100 followers um, and made it to St. Augustine, Florida. The Stono Rebellion, though, led to a severe tightening of the South Carolina slave laws. So they don't want that to happen again. In the 1740s, there was another uprising in New York City. Again, tried to burn part of the city and then use the distraction to sail for the Spanish islands. Modern evidence suggests that it probably was not actually a slave rebellion. It was probably just fear of a slave rebellion. People took what had happened in the early 1700s and when they saw a fire again, thought, oh my God, they're trying the same plot again. But yet recent examinations of the evidence suggest that there might not have been a slave rebellion in the 1740s at all. But 35 slaves were executed for their part in this maybe not a plot. Now, in the 1700s, already by the start of the 1700s, slave owners and their supporters were trying to say that slaves liked being slaves, that they had no understanding of freedom, no desire to be free, perfectly content to be slaves. But every time there's a revolt, that proves that that's a lie. And these newspapers that have pages and pages of advertisements for runaways proves that that's a lie. Dreams of freedom didn't know any racial boundary in colonial America. And when the revolution comes and white colonists rebel against authority, tens of thousands of slaves will seize the opportunity to do the same thing. And despite the fact that slavery was central to its empire, Great Britain prided itself on being the world's most advanced, freest nation. It was the era's greatest naval power, the century's greatest commercial power. That's true. It's also home to a complex governing system. It's got a common law and a common language, and with the exception of dissenting churches, a more or less common belief in Protestantism, the Church of England. For much of the 1700s, Britain was at war with somebody, usually France, and that also helped to create a common sense of identity and a pride in being British. Those wars also created a massive military establishment and high taxes to pay for it. That will cause problems. But central to this sense of British identity was the idea of liberty. The political struggles of the 1600s, the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, those had convinced Britons that they had fought for liberty, and liberty is now their unique possession. British liberty celebrated the rule of law, the right to live under laws that your own representatives had consented to. It celebrated the traditional rights of Englishmen. And it seemed like every political cause would try to gain support by wrapping itself in the language of liberty and claiming that it was defending the rights of Englishmen. Until the 1770s, most colonists believed that they were a part of the freest political system that mankind had ever known. British liberty was a collection of rights and a national characteristic and a state of mind. The concept was so expansive that there were a lot of contradictions inside it, and nobody seemed to mind. British freedom wasn't universal, though. It was closely identified with being Protestant and with being a specific kind of Protestant, with belonging to the Church of England. British freedom was fully compatible with, wide variations in personal privileges and rights. But in the minds of the free residents of Britain and its North American colonies, liberty was theirs. And liberty was central to two new sets of political beliefs that flourished in the Anglo-American world. These two new sets of political beliefs. The first one is called classical republicanism. Classical republicanism. Now, write this down. Classical republicanism is not the same thing as the modern Republican Party. Classical republicanism is not the same thing as the modern Republican Party. Classical republicanism literally means a government with no king, with no inherited power. So, like the time they beheaded Charles I and had no king for 11 years. That's republicanism. Classical republicanism also said that the essence of liberty is in citizens participating and taking responsibility for their government. They said that man reaches his highest fulfillment in civic virtue and public service. Now, these classical republicans usually assumed that only property owning, land owning men can possess civic virtue, which civic virtue isn't just a moral quality, it's a desire to serve the public good. Now, in the 1700s, this body of thought, classical republicanism, was closely associated with a group of political critics who condemned corruption. They said that Britain and its colonies were being threatened by greed and political manipulation by a loss of its civic virtue. The classical republicans didn't have a huge amount of impact in England itself, but they were very popular in the colonies. Colonial elites liked the idea that independent landowning men, aka them, ought to be politically active. Now, because classical republicanism at its foundation means no king, no inherited power, citizens taking responsibility for controlling their government, because that's what it means, every significant political party in the United States today has classical republicanism as its foundation. So, when you think of classical republicanism, don't think that they necessarily believe everything that the modern Republican Party believes, but the modern Republican Party does believe in these foundational ideas. No inherited power, no kings, regular citizens taking responsibility, aka voting. But so does the modern Democratic Party, right? Every major political party in the US and most of our third parties have classical republicanism, no kings, as their foundation. Now, the second set of new political ideas is called classical liberalism. Classical liberalism. Write this down. Classical liberalism is not the same thing as the modern Democratic Party. Classical liberalism is not the same thing as the modern Democratic Party. But again, there are some ideals that are part of classical liberalism that you will find in every current American political party. Classical liberalism is essentially about individual private rights. Classical republicanism had that civic virtue, social quality. Liberalism is essentially individual and private. The leading philosopher of classical liberalism was an Englishman named John Locke. Many earlier political philosophers had said that government was like family, that inequality is natural in both government and family, and that power should always come from the top, from God or the king or the husband. John Locke said that's not correct. John Locke said that governments were formed not by one man in power forcing everybody else, but by mutual agreement among equals. Mutual agreement among equals. Locke called this the social contract. He said that to form this social contract, to form a good government, men would come together and mutually decide to surrender some of their ability to govern themselves in order to enjoy the benefits of a society and the rule of law. But Locke said that some natural rights must always be retained by the people. Some natural rights that do not come from any government, that can't be granted by the king, can't be taken away by the king. Those must always be protected and retained by the people. Locke said that the purpose of government was to offer protection of those natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. And he said things like religion and family life and economic activity, that's not the government's business at all. During the 1700s, Locke's ideas, government by consent of the governed, unalienable individual rights, the right to rebel against unjust government, that's going to become very popular among a lot of colonists. Locke spoke of liberty as a universal right, but he, like a lot of other Englishmen, seemed willing to exclude many people from the full benefits of liberty. He was okay with extreme inequalities of wealth and well-being, and he essentially thought that the free individual was a landowning white man. Locke himself was actually anti-slavery. He also defended the rights of women to own property, but he helped to draft the Carolina Constitution, which allowed for slavery, because to him, property rights were more important. But when he said that all individuals possess some natural rights that no government should violate, Locke's ideas of classical liberalism opened the door for poor people and women and even slaves to challenge limits on their own freedom. Now, today we think of republicanism and liberalism as total opposites. But in the 1700s, those ideas overlapped a lot, and they often reinforced each other. People could consider themselves very much a liberal Republican in the 1700s. Both of these ideas inspire a commitment to constitutional government. They inspire opposition to tyranny. Both of them will be transported to the colonies, and they will both help to divide the empire. In colonial politics, for most of the 1700s, was a lot calmer than in the 1600s. In Britain itself, things were running a lot more smoothly, and in North America, the elites have a pretty good stranglehold on politics, so that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for fussing. In many ways, politics in the colonies were much more democratic than in Britain during the 1700s. Voting rights, it was a little different from colony to colony, but the linchpin of suffrage, of voting rights, was property ownership. People wanted to make sure that the men who were voting were the men who had something to lose if it all went wrong, and that meant property. Slaves and servants and women, adult sons who still lived with their parents, people who didn't own property, they are all considered dependent people, so of course they can't vote. But because land was widely available in most of the colonies, a pretty high percentage of men could vote. In Britain, where land was very limited and expensive, fewer than 5% of men could vote. But in the American colonies, more than half could. But this isn't democracy in a modern sense. It's not democracy the way that we would understand it. In a couple of places, like Long Island, women with property could vote, but almost everywhere else, voting was a male privilege. In a couple of colonies, Jews and Catholics could vote. In the vast majority, they cannot. And in some colonies, even Protestants who aren't Church of England can't vote. In the early part of the 1700s, free black people that owned property could vote in every colony. But by the middle of the century, Virginia, both Carolinas, and Georgia had revoked that. In the northern colonies, there weren't laws that kept black men from voting, but local tradition often did. And then, of course, Native people were not allowed to vote at all. Despite the fact that there was a pretty broad suffrage among white men, most elections were not contested. Typically, only one candidate would run, and he's usually a guy who is a member of the local elite families. Most of the power in the colonies lay with men who were appointed and not elected at all. So governors and councils were appointed by the king in 9 of the colonies. Only Rhode Island and Connecticut were allowed to elect their governors. And even if an elected assembly passed a law, the royally appointed governor could veto it, or Parliament in London could overturn it. Now, if you wanted to vote, you had to be male, you had to be over 21, and you had to own a certain amount of land. If you wanted to hold office, you would usually have to own extra land. Like in South Carolina, you could vote if you were male, 21, and had 50 acres. But to sit in the assembly, you needed 500 acres, which, nearly all of South Carolina's legislature were descended from the original wealthy settlers from Barbados. New York colonies politics were very boisterous, but there were only 30 seats in the entire legislature, and it was dominated by allies of those 5 wealthy families who had been friends with the Duke of York, like the Livingstons and the Delanceys. Between 1750 and 1776, 72 individual men sat in the New York legislature, and 52 of them were related to those 5 families. In many colonies, a majority of free white men might be able to vote, but they're very limited in their choice of who to vote for. There was a strong tradition of deference in particularly southern colonies. There was this assumption that men of wealth and education had a right to hold office, and other men did not. Like in Virginia, widespread suffrage for white men, but also a tradition that they should choose their lawmakers from certain elite families. Candidates for office, when elections were contested, when they actually had to campaign, did work really hard to court ordinary voters, but not the way we would think of today. Rather than talking about issues, they would usually set up food and ale tables at the balloting places, and you get people good and liquored up, and then remember that this was provided by Thomas Jefferson. When he ran for the House of Burgesses the first time, he hired more than 100 men to take rum, courtesy of Thomas Jefferson, to the major polling places. Even in New England, the leaders of the towns were usually part of the biggest property-owning families. Local offices were kind of passed down from generation to generation in the same family, and very few men tried to take an active role in politics. And for most of the early 1700s, Britain kind of neglected its colonies, and so that allowed the local elites to have a great deal of control. Those local elites particularly liked to use their control of colonial money to influence the governor and the royal councils. So the governor in 9 of the colonies was appointed by the king, but his salary had to be approved by the colonial legislature. So the king would send this guy over here, and then the colonial legislature would say, all right, we will authorize your pay for a year or for half a year. We're going to see how you do. And if you annoy us, we are not going to pay you after that point. So they would use the threat of no money, they would hold that over his head to make him do what they wanted. And in that way, legislators were able to get land and a voice in local law that they technically weren't supposed to have. And they were also able to make themselves even richer by doing that. Back in the 1600s, the governor was usually the focus of all authority. Colonial assemblies were pretty weak then. But in the 1700s, these assemblies become much more assertive. They insist that they should have the same rights and the same powers locally as Parliament has in London. And so those governors who want to be successful figure out very quickly that they have to cooperate with these assemblies. The most powerful colonial assembly was in Pennsylvania. The elected assembly was the only legislature in the colony. The governor's council had been disbanded. The Pennsylvania elected assembly got control of money and appointments and the colonial militia. A lot of problems between the early governors and their elected assembly over who ought to be in control, until eventually the governors realized that they're just going to have to give in. Now, these people, the elected office holders, the movers and the shakers, in every colony, those guys are probably going to be members of the elite. They will address each other in speeches and letters and pamphlets that are filled with Latin and Greek and references to classical philosophy. But underneath that, and for a long time almost unnoticed by the elites, there is a stirring among regular people. There's an expansion in the public sphere. And the public sphere is that part of politics and debate that's done by non-elected people. So when you get together with your friends and you complain about what the city council is doing, or what the president's doing, or what the police are doing, or anything that is related to the government, you are acting as part of the public sphere. And regular citizens are starting to discuss political issues that the elite think they should not be discussing, that used to be entirely the realm of the elite. In cities like Boston and Philadelphia and New York, clubs start to spring up, debating clubs where people would talk about science and philosophy and politics. And one of the best known was the Junto. It was a club in Philadelphia, founded by Benjamin Franklin. And eventually that club evolved into the American Philosophical Society, which still exists today. So you could actually join Benjamin Franklin's club. Colonial taverns and coffee houses also became important places where regular people would gather and talk and complain and debate politics. Philadelphia had more drinking establishments per capita than Paris did. The press also expanded rapidly, the written word, which made the English colonies pretty unique, actually. The colonies saw a really rapid increase in literacy, in the number of people who could read. Now, there were very few formal schools. Every New England town had to have a public school that would educate boys and girls up to a certain age, but universities were extremely rare. Fewer than 0.1% of men ever set foot in a university. But we see people putting an emphasis on teaching boys and girls at least a little bit of education. Typically, they would send their kids to a dame school, especially if you lived in New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Delaware, places like that, Maryland. You would send your kids to a dame school, which is an older woman, she is the dame, an older woman who needs to earn a little bit of money for herself, so she's probably a widow, and she can read and write and do a little bit of numbers, and she will teach what she knows to the children in the neighborhood in exchange for a copper penny or maybe half a pig when the slaughter time comes, just to keep herself alive. It's not an expansive education, but it does lead to a real growth in literacy. By the 1770s, about 75% of the free adult men could read and write, and a majority of families owned at least one book. Along with its taverns, Philadelphia was also known for having a lot of bookshops. Some towns set up lending libraries, which let people share knowledge, and the first lending library in the colonies was established by Benjamin Franklin. That allowed the middle classes of the American colonies, which is the majority of people, to be much better informed and much better educated than their equals in Europe would have been. We see a growth of newspapers. The first continuously published colonial newspaper appeared in 1704. That was the Boston Newsletter. By 1740, there were 13 colonial newspapers. By 1765, that had doubled. Probably the most widely read was the Pennsylvania Gazette, which was published by Benjamin Franklin. The Gazette had about 2,000 subscribers, and most of these papers by the 1730s are writing openly about the state of colonial politics. And that was absolutely necessary. The public sphere must have a free exchange of ideas. But neither freedom of the press nor freedom of expression were part of the rights of Englishmen. Freedom of speech, remember, only applied to members of Parliament while they were speaking in Parliament. It was not a right of ordinary citizens. A person could still be beheaded for making certain criticisms of the king himself. There were criminal penalties for criticizing the government in general. And there's no free press. The British government, the colonial governments, they all believe that if the press is dangerous, if people find out the truth, they'll get all stirred up. Back during the English Civil War, we talked about the levelers. One of the things that they wanted was a written constitution that would guarantee freedom of the press, but they didn't get it. Until 1695, any printed work could be pre-censored. It had to have a government license before you could print it at all. After 1695, the government stopped pre-censoring, so you could print things, but the government had a really heavy hand on anything that you did print. And writers and publishers could be put on trial for seditious libel, for saying mean things about government officials. Dozens of publishers in the colonies in the 1700s got hauled up before the colonial assemblies and were forced to apologize for criticizing something in some way. And if they refused, they went to jail. James Franklin, Benjamin's brother, spent a month in jail in the 1720s after publishing a kind of mean-spirited satirical piece on the New England governments. The newspapers and the publishers, they do fight against censorship. They argue that freedom of the press and freedom of speech were necessary for freedom of thought. And freedom of thought was becoming an increasingly popular idea. During the 1700s, many colonists began to be influenced by a third new philosophical idea. This is called the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers wanted to apply scientific principles like research and investigation and experimentation, apply those to human society and politics. Benjamin Franklin was probably the best known American Enlightenment thinker. I mean, everything that he did, right? His library, his newspaper, his debating club, his experiments with electricity, those all exemplified the Enlightenment spirit. And because Enlightenment thinkers wanted to apply reason and investigation to everything, they were often seen as a threat by those who traditionally held power. The most radical of the Enlightenment thinkers wanted to get rid of traditional ideas entirely, research what would be better than them. So let's get rid of the monarchy. Let's get rid of the nobility. Let's get rid of the power of the established churches. John Locke, the father of classical liberalism, he is also an Enlightenment philosopher, and he had published a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And in that book, he said that religious belief should rest on evidence, that every individual should be able to look for evidence to support their religious beliefs, and if they can't find evidence, they shouldn't believe it. Now, Locke is Christian himself. He believes that there is evidence that satisfies him that it's correct. But he says that just because it satisfies him doesn't mean that it has to satisfy everyone else. That if someone else looks and doesn't find evidence to their satisfaction, then they shouldn't believe the same thing. During the 1700s, many prominent Americans, especially members of the political elite, began to adopt Arminianism, or what the authorities called the Arminian heresy. Arminianism said that reason alone should be the basis of religion, and religion should only be practiced by people who can freely investigate their options and then choose what they want to do. Today, that does not sound like a radical idea, right? Like Southern Baptists, they're one of the largest denominations in the U.S. The Southern Baptists teach that a child should not be baptized until that child is old enough to understand what they're doing and freely choose to do it. In the 1700s, that was heresy. It won't become a widespread mainstream philosophy until the 1800s. Other Americans, particularly Franklin, Jefferson, guys like that, adopt a religious belief sort of called deism. Deism is the belief that there is a creator of some sort, but that the creator doesn't interfere with the world. They often described it as being like a divine clockmaker. So a clockmaker makes a clock, he puts the pieces together so that they function in the correct way, and then he leaves it alone. And the clock tick-tocks on its own from that point. Deists believed that the creator set up scientific principles for the world to function around properly, and then left the universe alone to tick-tock. In the late 1600s, Isaac Newton had proved that there were natural laws that governed the physical universe, and deists believed that those natural laws were proof of some creator's handiwork. Deists tended to believe that the best form of worship of the creator was not going to church, but by studying nature, the laws of nature, and understanding the way the world had been set up. The deists thought that things like miracles were outdated superstition and not fit for this modern scientific age. Like freedom of speech and freedom of the press, this religious freedom was another area where the actual experience of liberty went far beyond what the legal limits were. Religion was still central to people's lives in the 18th century. Sermons and treatises and copies of the Bible were always the best-selling category of printed material. Religious arguments got a lot more attention than political debates until about the 1760s. But still, many church leaders worried that their flocks are shrinking. Fewer people going to church, worldly affairs taking up more of the colonists' time. And a lot of these ministers were concerned that economic growth, westward expansion, the Enlightenment were undermining religion. And those fears inspired a revival movement that swept through the colonies called the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening it starts as this attempt to get people back into church. It starts as this series of local revivals that try to get people back in the pews by creating a more emotional, more personal style of preaching. It will end up going so far beyond what those original ministers thought or wanted it to do. During the 1730s, a group of Congregationalists mostly, but also some Presbyterian ministers, created a really intensely emotional style of preaching. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield were the most famous of these, and they were kind of masters of this intense emotional preaching style. Jonathan Edwards is the man who wrote Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. It is probably the most famous sermon ever. And in this sermon, he talks about mankind as being a loathsome insect, suspended over a bottomless pit of eternal fire that might break at any moment. And he would get his congregation all worked up and hysterical and in terror that their thread is going to break. And then he told them that they could be born again. They could confess their sins, they could ask for divine grace, and that would save them. According to Whitefield and Edwards and the other Great Awakening preachers, God was merciful. They are both Congregationalist ministers, and most of the ministers who start the Great Awakening are Congregationalists, which means they're Puritans. But now they're saying men and women are not predestined, the way the old 1600s Puritans had said. Now Puritan ministers, Congregationalist ministers, are saying that people can save themselves by repenting. So they talk about the horrors of damnation, but also the joys of salvation. They ask their congregations to look into their hearts and ask themselves, am I saved? And if you are familiar with modern evangelical Christianity, that style of preaching is ringing a really big bell for you right now. The Great Awakening preachers start to spread. We see folks from not traditional churches get involved. And when that happens, the established churches, the Church of England in the South and the Congregationalist Church in the North, become critical of these new preachers. They see preachers from like the Methodists and the Baptists. This Great Awakening was not created for them. It was created to get butts in the seats for the Puritan churches and the Anglican churches. But now it's spreading. And it's outside of the control of those original preachers. And these new preachers that are getting involved are often not formally trained. They didn't go to college. And so the older preachers accuse them of causing disorder and being disrespectful and telling people it's okay to decide for themselves. What kind of nonsense is that, right? Decide for yourself. Your soul is between you and God and nobody else. You can't tell people that. The older churches that started this because they were afraid of losing congregants become even more afraid of losing congregants. Not to the Enlightenment and not to secular issues, but to smaller churches that are suddenly starting to grow. By the time the Great Awakening was over in the 1760s, there were entirely new dissenting churches that had been created. The Baptists and the Methodists become huge, particularly in the South. The South used to be entirely Anglican. Well, really, most of the South didn't attend church at all, but the church that they didn't go to was the Anglican church. Now they're going to the Baptist and the Methodist churches. The Presbyterians expand. The Quakers, who have been saying this kind of stuff for centuries, they also get bigger. And the Presbyterians, and the Quakers, and the Baptists, and the Methodists begin to criticize the way that the Congregationalist and Anglican churches dominated politics, got special protections, and were supported by tax money. And these smaller churches that have suddenly expanded begin to defend religious freedom in a way that we haven't seen before. The Great Awakening also reflected social tensions and questioned authority and inspired regular people to criticize different parts of colonial society. One of the criticisms of the Great Awakening was that it attracted those who were, according to one old preacher, rude and ignorant. It attracts people who are at the bottom of society, the people who have the most to question and criticize. And they argue that businessmen and merchants throughout the colonies are being greedy and corrupt and unchristian, that the planters are putting profit ahead of salvation, they're being worldly and extravagant. A few preachers even explicitly condemned slavery. And there were a handful of slave owners who freed their slaves as a result of that. The vast majority of slave owners did not. The vast majority reconciled their new emotional beliefs with keeping their economic stake in slaveholding. But these revivals brought many slaves themselves into the Christian fold, which was a huge step in the foundations of African American cultures, and some slaves took up preaching themselves. The revivals also inspired a small group of women to start preaching, which was not allowed at all by the traditional churches. And the impact of the Great Awakening spread way beyond spiritual matters. It sparked a newspaper war that greatly expanded printed material in the colonies, which expanded literacy. The Great Awakening also encouraged people to listen to their own minds, not just in religion, but in everything. And so they started to question what the elites and the authorities told them. These revivals encouraged independent thinking, and that is going to have a significant impact on the future of the colonies. The growth of Britain's North American colonies happened at a time when all of the empires are jockeying for position, and that power struggle will involve a lot of what is now the United States. But England's rivals usually had colonies that were not very populated and were much weaker economically. Now, the Spanish Empire south of the Rio Grande was huge and powerful. But north of the Rio Grande, they had some more difficulties. North of the Rio Grande, it stretched from the California coast through the plains, east to Florida, off and on, also included bits of the Great Lakes area. On paper, it's a huge territory. But Spanish North America, the Spanish colonies in what is today the United States, only had a few very small, isolated towns, and not much support from Spain itself. The Spanish government decided that they were going to try to bulk up their empire, boost the population and the economy of their empire north of the Rio Grande. But it seemed like no matter what they did, none of it seemed to work that well. Most of their northern colonies still depended on the Indian trade or on forcing Indian labor. New Mexico Territory in 1765, Spanish territory, only had about 10,000 Spanish-descended settlers. Their Texas territory by 1770 had only about 2,000 Spanish-descended settlers. Out on the Pacific coast, Spain is getting hassled by Russia. Russian fur traders had built a series of forts and trading posts in Alaska and were starting to kind of push further down the Pacific coast. And Spain kind of panicked at the idea that Russia might start pushing south enough to maybe take some of their claimed territory. So they put a lot of effort into colonizing California. They build a string of Spanish missions and presidios all along the California coastline, from San Diego up to Sonoma. Father Junipero Serra was the head of the mission network, and is today one of the most controversial figures in California history. Serra founded the first California mission in San Diego, and was in charge of the entire network until he died in the 1780s. He was widely praised in Spain for converting thousands of Indians to Christianity and teaching them Spanish, and he said introducing agriculture, which was a lie. Agriculture already existed before the Spanish arrived. A couple of years ago, Father Junipero Serra was made a saint in the Catholic Church. But there are serious criticisms among the descendants of the Cahuilla, the Cochimi, the Camaya, and the other people who were essentially enslaved. Not even essentially, who were just enslaved at Serra's missions. At some of the missions he ran, the mortality rate was ridiculously high. The Mission Dolores in San Francisco had about a 70% mortality rate over 5 years. So, if you were there for 5 years, 75% of the people who went in with you would be dead. When the Spanish began settling California, it was a densely populated area, between about 250 and 300,000 native people. But just like everywhere else, soldiers and missionaries were disastrous for the locals. California was very much a mission frontier. These missions were both religious institutions and centers of government and labor. And so Father Sarah and the other missionaries relied on forced Indian labor to grow grain, work in the orchards, tend the livestock. The combination of enslavement, harsh conditions, starvation, new disease devastated native societies in California. By 1821, when Mexico won its independence from Spain, California's native population had declined by more than a third. But California still hadn't attracted Spanish settlers. In 1800, Los Angeles was the largest town, with 300 people. When Spanish rule ended in 1821, Los Angeles was still the largest town, had about 3,000 people. So Spain is not the hugest threat to the English colonies. Spanish North America, or Spanish territories north of the Rio Grande, were insignificant compared to Mexico and Spanish Central America and Spanish South America. France was a threat. Now, when we talked about New France in the 1600s, we talked about all of their difficulties, how hard it was for them to attract settlers to start with, how the majority of indentured servants would just leave as soon as their contracts were up, and how the population of New France never really got very big. At its height, about 19,000 people were there in the 1600s. But during the 1700s, things get a lot better for them. The population and the economy of French Canada expanded rapidly. French fur traders push into the Mississippi River Valley from the lakes. They start settling down around the Gulf Coast, and they start pushing north from there. In the St. Lawrence Valley of Canada, really prosperous farming communities developed. Now, the French population in what is today the United States was still less than 20,000 people. But French Canada was in its heyday. By 1750, the St. Lawrence Valley alone on the French-Canadian side had about 55,000 colonists. And that's putting pressure on the neighboring British colonies. These French-Canadian farmers want more land. Pushing north is not really going to help them. The farther north you go in Canada, the colder and more tundra-y and less farmable it is. So the land that they want, they're thinking they might have to snatch from English settlers, who are obviously not going to take that without a fight. All along the frontier, the French started to build forts and trading posts that ringed the British colonies and tried to make it impossible for the British to expand. French and British fur traders competed for access to the native trade. They fought each other for alliances, and French farmers started to push southward into land claimed by English farmers. For much of the 1700s, the western frontier of British North America, anywhere where the French and the British came in contact, was a flashpoint for violence. The Ohio River Valley in particular, the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, got caught up in this complex struggle for power that involved the French and the British, also rival Indian communities on both sides, groups of settlers on their own, land companies who are trying to take advantage of all sides. The Ohio Valley, by this point, was home not only to its traditional residents, but also to other nations who had been pushed out of their own land. The Shawnee and the Delaware people were looking for a place to settle after they had been pushed further west. Cherokee and Chickasaw people were being pushed around in the southern colonies, and so some of them moved into the Ohio Valley. There were a number of villages, they were called middle ground villages, where members of lots of different tribes lived together, sometimes along with the European fur traders, the occasional missionary, just because there's not really anywhere else for them to go. For those people, if it comes to war between Britain and France, that is a huge threat to their survival, but it could also be an opportunity. One Delaware Nation spokesman said, "Right now it is impossible to know where our land is, for the French claim all the land on one side of the river, and the English claim the other side. If they can choose the winning side in a potential war, then the Delaware might be able to use that as leverage to get a land claim recognized for themselves." Now, on the other hand, there were some Indian nations that were very good at playing European empires against each other and using that to gain control of more land and trade networks. The Iroquois Confederacy were masters at that. The British usually thought that they were allied with the Iroquois, and they accepted most Iroquois land claims, even the ones all the way into the Ohio, even into the Ohio Valley. The British would accept Iroquois land claims there. Now, of course, the French and the actual natives of the Ohio Valley did not accept those claims. Now, in the 1750s, there were only a few white settlers in the Ohio region, but farmers and planters and land companies had an eye on the very fertile Ohio River Valley. In 1749, the government of Virginia gave an immense grant of land, 500,000 acres, to a group of Virginia elites who called themselves the Ohio Land Company. And the shareholders of this company included the governor of Virginia and members of the Lee family, the Carters, the Washingtons. That land grant threatened French claims in the Great Lakes and the Ohio region. There was a rush of land speculators to this territory to try and claim it and survey it and sell it off. And so the French start to build up their military presence. It's this grant of land, it's this 500,000 acres that is going to spark war between Britain and France, what will become the 7 Years' War. And the outcome of this war that started in the American frontier will change the global balance of power. Now, the 7 Years' War will become a worldwide struggle for domination between empires. It will eventually spread and be fought in Europe and Africa and Asia, but it started almost by mistake. In 1754, when the British authorities sent a young army major with almost no experience out into the Ohio country to try to persuade the French to leave, to abandon their forts. This is the French fort that 21-year-old George Washington was sent to ask the French to leave, so that the Ohio Land Company could actually take this land. Washington took 2 companies of soldiers with him, asked the French to vacate the fort so that the company could start settling this land, and the French said no. And so Washington began to build his own fort, Fort Necessity. Let's do a real quick comparison. This is the French fort with artillery. This is Washington's fort. The French took exception to Washington building his fort and attacked it, and almost immediately won. Washington lost about a third of his men. He had to surrender. Another British expedition was sent out by a much more experienced British commander, sent to relieve Washington and his men, and finally, by God, force the French out. That expedition was ambushed by the French, and it left 2/3 of the British men dead or wounded. And really, for the first couple years of the war, that is how it will go against the British. The French and their native allies will capture British forts. The southern backcountry is just going to burn. Both sides acted atrociously. Some native nations took the opportunity to push back against settlers, since the colonial militias were busy elsewhere. In Pennsylvania, hundreds of colonists were killed. In Nova Scotia, in French Canada, the British rounded up thousands of local French settlers, the Acadians, and expelled them from the region. Many of them went to the French colony of Louisiana, where the Acadians became Cajuns. The British government raised huge amounts of money. They poured men and resources into the war effort, and eventually the tide of battle turned. In particular, Britain wanted to hit France at its weakest spot, which was the North American colonies. By 1759, Britain and its colonists and its native allies, including the Iroquois Confederacy, had captured almost all of the important French forts. By 1760, the British had seized nearly all of the French Caribbean and defeated French Canadian forces and had even seized control of India. 3 years later, the peace treaty was signed. In the Treaty of Paris, 1763, France gave control of Canada and all its land east of the Mississippi to Britain. But when the French pulled out of eastern North America, they left their native allies, including the Ottawa and the Miami and the Shawnee, without a European partner. Now, the various nations in the Ohio Valley region had worked very hard to keep a balance of power that would let them have some independence. But now the balance is gone. The Treaty of Paris that ended this war left those tribes more dependent on the British than they'd ever been on the French. And it created massive confusion over land claims and who controls the fur trade and tribal relations in general. To those nations, it became obvious that British expansion was a major threat to them. In 1763, right in the aftermath of the French defeat, the tribes of the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes launched a revolt against British control. And this is called Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac was a war leader of the Ottawa Nation, but he was heavily influenced by a Delaware religious leader named Nowlin. Nowlin had a vision in which the Master of Life told him that his people must reject European ways, free themselves of all ties to the Europeans, and drive the British off Indian land. And I'm intentionally using the word Indian land and not just Delaware land, because this was one of the earliest attempts to form a pan-Indian movement. Nowlin preached that no matter what the differences were between the tribes, all Indian nations were one people, and they must cooperate to get their independence back. Nowlin was a huge influence on Pontiac. Pontiac will try to craft a rebellion that is really cooperative among all of the nations. So in mid-1763, Pontiac's Ottawa, plus Huron, plus Shawnee and Miami and a whole bunch of other nations attacked Fort Detroit. They seized 9 other forts, and they killed hundreds of white settlers who were encroaching on land that was supposed to still be Indian land. British forces counterattacked, and over the next few years, the tribes will individually be forced to make peace. But the start of that uprising so terrified the British government that they issued the Proclamation of 1763. It's this red line here, basically the spine of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation of 1763 was meant to keep settlers and native people apart. The proclamation said that British colonists are no longer allowed to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Everything west of the mountains is reserved for native tribes. The British wanted to make sure that there would no longer be any conflict between their colonists and native people, that their colonists would no longer die in an Indian war because their colonists just won't be there. But what this proclamation did was just outrage the British settlers. Colonists had expected that when the French left, all of this land west of the mountains that used to be claimed by France will now be open to British settlers. They had accepted as part of their pay land vouchers to land in the Great Lakes in the Ohio country, and now they're shut out. So resentment starts to build. Now, the 7 Years' War redrew the map of the world, and it created a lot of drama in the colonies as well. That drama really exploded in Pennsylvania. This war shattered the control of the old Quaker elite, and it ended Pennsylvania's policy of dealing fairly with Native people. During the war, with the frontier kind of exploding in battles between settlers and Native groups, settlers in western Pennsylvania demanded that their colonial government step up and be more aggressive toward those tribes. The governor of Pennsylvania agreed. He declared war on the Delaware, he offered a bounty for Delaware scalps, and he raised a militia. But the majority of the colonial legislature was Quaker. They're pacifists, and they still support William Penn's original idea of fair dealing. But they couldn't overrule the governor, so most of the legislature resigned in protest. And in that one move, Quakers lost control forever of Pennsylvania politics. The men who were elected to take their place are incredibly aggressive, almost all not Quaker, and they are going to continue this war. In December of 63, while Pontiac's rebellion is still ongoing, 50 Scotch-Irish farmers burned a Conestoga Indian town to the ground, massacred everyone who was there. They accused the colonists, accused the colonial government of being too lenient toward the Indians, kind of like the men who had joined Bacon's rebellion a century before. These Pennsylvania colonists demand that all Indians be removed from the colony. And when the governor wouldn't go quite that far, they marched on Philadelphia. They burned every Indian village that they found on the way, including a number of praying Indian towns, towns of Indian people who had converted to Christianity. So the governor caved and ordered most of the Indian population to move west. And Pennsylvania's holy experiment, as William Penn had wanted it, was over. The nations of the lakes and the Ohio Valley came out of the war with a sense of collective identity, and so did British colonists. Before the war, the colonies had been pretty isolated from each other. There wasn't much travel between colonies, except in New England, where they're all tiny. More colonists traveled to England itself than to their nearest neighboring colony. But taking part in the 7 Years' War created greater bonds between the colonies, and it also made them proud to be a part of the British Empire. Colonial militias fought alongside British professional troops against the French. Now, there were often tensions between the professional soldiers and the often undisciplined colonial troops, but the common experience of battle united them. But those English colonists who came out of the war with a new sense of identity also leave the war with new countrymen, those French-Canadian settlers. Now that Britain controls Canada and its thousands of French Catholics, British colonists in the original 13 colonies are not sure what to do. There are questions about how well British liberty will cope with the differences between its subjects. And very quickly, English colonists will start to question whether British liberty is now good enough for them, whether being a part of the British Empire is a benefit for them or a threat. And so we will enter the Revolutionary period.